Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I see the participants' numbers going a bit up, and we already have a good amount of people here. Today, we're going to spend about an hour talking about a question that sounds operational, but is actually quite strategic: how to design a sales compensation plan that actually makes sense and fits your business where you are right now. So it's not just about OTE and whether that's competitive, but also the underlying compensation structure, considerations for the business model overall, and maybe also some experience that our speakers are going to share. So as most of you know, Ravio sits across data across the whole globe, where we can highlight where OTE can be a competitive lever and compensation can be a lever, but obviously sometimes a plan can go wrong. Founders might not even realize it. So that's what we'll talk about today. And I'm joined by two great people here that have a lot more experience in this than I have. So on one hand, we have Vincent, who spent 15 plus years in some of the biggest brands we know, Cisco, DocuSign, and many more, where he scaled compensation. But we also have Siobhan here, who's actually scaled sales teams. So she can talk a lot more about the inner works. And you've done that, I think, at Dropbox, Figma, and now you're at Fin. So welcome, both of you. Before we get things started, can I ask you both to introduce yourself? And I'll, as usual, ladies first.
Thank you. Thanks, Julia. So yes, my name is Siobhan. I'm based out of Dublin. So recently moved from London, where I was working for Figma, leading the EMEA org as GM. We had offices in London, Paris, and Berlin. So I ran with them for quite a number of years, and obviously a huge growth and massive growth inflection point for me in my career. Prior to that, I was at Dropbox, where I was also primarily based out of London. Ran a number of different teams throughout that journey across mid-market enterprise, and then eventually UK country manager. So excited to be here and have this discussion.
Great to have you. Over to you, Vincent.
Cool. Yeah. So Vincent, I'm based here just outside of London, so in the UK. My background is sort of generally quite broad rewards. I've spent sort of all of it, and then the last, to Julia's point, sort of 15 or so years really specialised in sales compensation design and strategy. A big chunk of my time was with Cisco, which was obviously pretty large scale. I'm part of the global function there, and that was some interesting, exciting things to get into. Since then, I spent sort of more time intentionally with some more European companies, outside of DocuSign. That was obviously West Coast based as well. Really starting to, over the last few years, really spend some time more with some sort of SaaS, some European headquartered companies, sort of smaller in size and even sort of pre-IPO. So it's been really interesting seeing some sort of very large scale projects and the fundamentals that you develop in those, trying to sort of think of how they can work or you can learn from them as you look at maybe a smaller company in a more sort of very high growth sort of area. So it's been an interesting period.
Cool. And I think that's a really good segue. Before we kick off with some questions, I'd like to ask the audience to fill out the survey or the poll on the site. So we'd love to learn a bit more about you so we can guide the conversation in the right direction. What's your status quo? Are you established? Are you happy? Are you reviewing things? Maybe you're still improving. Maybe you're just here to learn. If you don't mind filling that in. And I can see there seems to be already a quick winner here. Okay, things are changing a bit, but overall it looks like most of you have something in place and still improving or changing things along the way. So that's interesting, because then we can talk a lot about that today, how to react to things when the business is changing, or even how to improve things overall. Which, let's start with more high-level compensation when we're talking about candidates. So I know, Siobhan, you must have hired across the board for all kinds of reps. So when today, and maybe even back in the day, when you look at offers you want to put through the candidate, early stage or even late stage, what's your impression they're typically evaluating when they see an offer on the table?
Yeah, I think firstly, important to bear in mind that the people that are interviewing with you are typically have a few years of experience. Obviously, it depends on the level you're hiring for, But usually those individuals come equipped with some degree of knowledge on their own of what good looks like. So either that'll be from peers in their market, if they're, you know, based in Dublin, London or beyond, they'll have a sense of what their worth is. That's the first thing, but they're usually, that's kind of table stakes. They're usually looking for information beyond that. The second thing as a sales rep is how achievable is my OTE. It's one thing being told that this is my potential earnings. What are the chances of me making that kind of money? So they're going to want clarity on how they achieve their OTE. And if that's not clear to you and you're not able to clearly articulate it, that's a problem. Like, you start to lose trust and credibility with the candidate that's interviewing with you. Immediately they're wondering either you're not close enough to that part of the org, or you have a compensation plan that is complex, or maybe you're just trying to disguise a problem in the business. Maybe people aren't actually achieving their quotas and targets, and they just start questioning. So the ability to clearly articulate what that plan looks like and how they hit those metrics is really important. And then on top of that, usually there's some element of, not usually, sorry, but sometimes element of equity. So what is that? And being able to have you or recruiters accurately talk through what that narrative looks like is important. And the devil is in the detail in that too. You know, is it options? Is it RSUs? It's really important that you know that and you're not kind of fluffing around that, because one mistake in that, and I've seen this happen also, just makes you start to question a little bit credibility. So yeah, from an operator perspective, I think that's the starting point really. There's table stakes. Yeah,
I think, and we will get back to, I would say, the entire targets plan and how you're going to get to target a bit later, because I know it came up in one of Vincent's comments as well. Do you see there is a significant difference in company stage, especially early stage might not be able to offer the same kind of OTE structure than maybe an established enterprise player? Do you see major differences there in how they're building their reward package and offer?
Yeah, some differences. I wouldn't say they're major. So there's obviously variance, not obviously, sometimes variance in the size of the actual salary package. And then there's going to be variances in the percentage of base versus compensation, depending on how early in the sales cycle you are. Some people tend to go for a higher base split, so like a 70% base versus 30% compensation if you're really new to the market and you haven't really figured out what good looks like, and so you're trying to protect your hire's salary. So yeah, I think that's one thing that I would notice. The other in kind of earlier stage companies is obviously the equity piece. And for me, what's really important here to lean into isn't just you know, okay, here's your equity. This is the ability to like 5-10x and go to the moon. They're aware of that while they're interviewing, but the important piece is selling them on the vision. And I think what earlier stage companies have an advantage in here is that, you know, they've probably recently gone through these discussions with investors. They have their investor decks and they're used to like having to go through exercises where they're constantly reassessing their roadmap and their direction and thinking about their ICP, and sharing that with the candidates that you're hiring. I think is really important at that stage, like getting them excited in the same way you would an investor, gets them bought into their ability to just join the company, not just earn money, but like feel like they're joining a rocket ship, because what they are taking on there, while there's upside in equity, is a degree of risk. So yeah, another piece to call out.
Yeah. And I think you talked really nicely around how to land an offer, how to get a candidate across the line, but you also referenced already sort of compensation design. Vincent, what's sort of your experience? How often do you see maybe a structure in itself maybe not having been thoroughly thought through, or what are some advice on that side you can give to our audience?
Have I seen a structure not thoroughly thought through before? Yeah, I mean, yes. But I think, you know, I'm going to kind of echo a bit what Siobhan is saying. You know, I think particularly at the point of hire, the point of discussion, simplicity is king. You know, if you also extrapolate a little bit and think of, you know, the EU directive that's coming in, you know, pure OTE, you know, what I'm getting at OTE is now going to be known very soon by everybody, right? So that's not now going to always be the differentiator. And I think it kind of becomes incumbent on those, lots of people actually, but the TA function, the hiring managers, everyone around to really be able to sell the sales plan. And if you can't sell the sales plan, it's too complicated. And it does, to Siobhan's point, it tells you a lot of things when it becomes over convoluted, because I was saying in an ideal world, a sales plan has one metric and that person goes sells that one thing in that way. The reason we ever have more than that is because we're asking them to both go sell something, but possibly sell it in a particular fashion, okay? Or we're looking to partner. The problem is when we start to build out multiple metrics, and if that starts to be in the head of the salesperson at the point of hire, if I was that salesperson, it would tell me that I don't know if they've got all their roles understood correctly, because I think the point of it is that, when I've seen the worst examples of it is where no one's quite clear on who plays what in that sales cycle process. And that continues to evolve, right? Because we keep changing the models at which we're working. But we're not understanding, therefore, there's a bit of a scattergun approach, which makes people think that that's driving partnership. It doesn't. It drives confusion. So I think, a good test on whether the sales plan is good or not is can you sell it? A seller wants to know what they're going to get paid. And like I say, once OTE is kind of very transparent, and yes, it's a factor, but it's, it's not your only thing anymore. They're interested in where I make the money. And that's got to be explainable. They've got to feel that that's realistic, and that's where they trust you or don't trust you. And I think, good sellers who you're trying to capture will want that information because they've been there, they've been above 100%, they know what happens, that's why they're good. So they're going to be drilling you on it. So I think that needs to be really clear and really well articulated. So there's a million things, but I would just keep coming back to simplicity. Make it simple. The world of some organizations is not particularly simple, but I think from a sales compensation standpoint, try not to, as I once got told, a very Americanism is, don't try and boil the ocean with one sales plan. Keep it straightforward, keep it simple, and test it on being able to sell it itself, I think is maybe one way of looking at it.
Yeah, I would agree on that in terms of what I've seen. Now, two things that you both already alluded a bit on was, earlier stage companies might need to over-index on other things, maybe vision or a few other things. We see that as well in our client base, that often they're benchmarking against the wrong companies. We often hear, but I want to pay as FANG. Well, you're not FANG. Have you considered whether you can at all pay on that level or not? Siobhan, what would be your advice in terms of who the right peer group is? And when you think about designing a incentive plan together with a reward leader, or even a compensation, how to get to target, how often do you also factor in the competitive plays and the peer groups you might want to benchmark against?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, that's where there are actually external resources that you can lean into that give you a sense of what comp bands look like in your, whether it's like by industry or city or otherwise. When you think about peer groups, I would be reluctant to have a named list of companies unless you're a very established organization that is clearly already hiring. And sometimes there are organizations like this, right, where there's a bit of a rotating door between employees kind of swapping between some of these larger like FANG companies. But if you're not in that bucket, I would steer away from trying to have like your set list of companies that you're trying to benchmark yourself against.
So keeping it less specific, broader in terms of who your peer group is. But do you agree, Vincent? Would you advise that as well?
Yeah, I do. I think, and I'm having this conversation, have had this conversation a lot over the last sort of 6 months. It's really hard because you're balancing affordability, fiscal responsibility, and aspiration, right? So you want to be able to drag from those 5 companies, but the reality is you've got to make it sustainable. So it's really hard. I think with everything, and I think Siobhan's right. There's plenty of data out there, and more with all the sort of AI agents and pieces like that you can build around it can be really understandable, and you can really access some good stuff on it. It's one piece of data. I think that's the point, right? It's one piece of data. So if a account executive in London at a P5 gets paid X, and that's a very broad spread, okay, it's a piece of information. It isn't the Bible. Don't get me wrong, not the Bible. It isn't, it isn't, set in stone. It's one piece of information you balance with how strategic is that hire, how much sort of growth on them are you placing? Is that your first hire in that organization that almost needs to grow that team where they're at? So you've got to apply some logic, and I think balance that with some fiscal responsibility. Try and extrapolate out. Can you keep doing that for the next 6 to 12 months, 24 months? So I think it's a number of things. Data great, really understand the kind of people you need, and then be realistic to the period of time you're in, because what you're doing right now might not be the way you're going to be in 6, 12 months. So know what you're getting into, I think is it.
So once we're in it, you've hired your candidates, right? I mean, we've all experienced this in a variety of post surveys where compensation comes up, but often at the point where it then shows up in a post survey or engagement survey, it's often a bit too late. Obviously, at that point, your structure, obviously was not the right one for your business. I'd be curious, Ron, when reps start leaving on your front, when they left potentially because the compensation wasn't the right one, what was your move? How did you address that?
Yeah, I think maybe just picking up on something Vincent just said, which I think is important, is when you think about how you arrive at OTE, it's not kind of obviously some arbitrary number. There has to be some value that person brings when they're coming into the organization. In sales, we're very lucky that that value is a very clearly established number. And usually that is some sort of multiple of their OTE. And this very much varies depending on what organization you're talking to. In the past, it was kind of 3-4x was the industry standard. You'll speak to companies now that are, I'll say, boasting that they do 20x of OTE per hire. That's very much on the upper end. But you're going to have a point of view on that. And how you arrive at that number, so how many dollars that rep needs to bring in versus their OTE is established in 2 ways inside the organization, right? So the first is usually tops down, where you have your CFO and your C-suite deciding on what good looks like for next year. So what does the growth plan look like? Are we looking to grow the business by 40%, 100%? What is that multiple? And then there's a bottoms up job that needs to be done, which is what is the, how do we get to that number? So what does that sourcing or resourcing look like? And when you think about the resourcing, you have to be really thoughtful around that piece. So what is the expectation you're putting on the rep in terms of revenue to bring in, and how much of the work are they responsible for in landing that revenue, or do they have resources around them to support them? And that's going to vary depending on the size of your organization. But in more kind of established or even medium-sized organizations, that's maybe marketing resources or even sales operations. So that's the first thing. And I think that's an important context to set, because when reps leave, often there's different reasons for this, right? There's definitely worlds where, people leave because of culture or managers or all sorts of other elements. But when we feel like they're leaving because of their earnings, a few things to look at. One is you don't start with their OTE, you start with their take home. Like, what are they actually bringing home into their pocket? And I think if you're not clued in enough to this, sometimes you might miss that some of your best performing reps or people that you have high hopes or belief in but maybe haven't quite gotten there yet are just really struggling with like the revenue and money that they're actually putting into their pocket. So trying to be mindful of that is like a first principle, I think. The second is to the point about resourcing. How are you enabling those reps to achieve their number, and do they feel supported? So if you've decided that you're going to crack into France and you're going to start planting a rep there and expecting them to generate a whole load of revenue, and you've set a target against that, how are they getting supported? And I think that's often what I see when people are looking to leave. It's that we haven't been in the weeds enough on like how we've built the expectations around that rep. We're not clear on what they're actually taking home in their pocket, and we're not properly resourcing them to be successful.
So we're going back to, is the sales plan there? Is it efficient enough to help them get to the OTE that they were promised in the first place, or to a reasonable take home. So it's again less so the comp plan, but potentially the underlying sales strategy that you're alluding to.
Yes.
Is that what you see, Vincent, as well? Like more often than not being the underlying issue?
I do. I think the sales plan itself, I feel sorry for sometimes. It seems to be the first thing to get beaten up, when we're paying too much, when we're paying too little, when people are leaving, when people aren't going, all these sort of things. We talked about this the other day, I think, and Siobhan, you're kind of talking to it, but I think when we think about compensation and somebody ticking that box of why they left because of compensation, I think you've got to think of that ecosystem that sits around what constitutes that person getting their compensation. That comes from everything from realistic territory design. That comes from everything from, logical quota setting. It comes from differentiating pay. People may be getting paid. They may be getting above 100%, but are you paying them enough? You've got too flat a sort of ratio in terms of differentiating pay for your high performers. So, it's the ecosystem of things that sit around it. And I think one thing that I see from large to small and sort of trying to understand that world of it, and you talked about it, Siobhan, in terms of that sort of ratio that people use in terms of OTE to quota. It's a really good reference point. It's a look back reference point in big organizations to say, are we generally doing this? What I would say is that I think sometimes where it can become a problem in smaller companies, it is the first thing they think about. It drives the mathematics of what you're doing. So think about that in terms of, we've got a $2 million opportunity across this region, and I've got 2 people, and we're doing it. It's $1 million each, right? And that makes sense from an OTE. They're both in the same OTE. The realities are your need and your development in one area is going to be entirely different than another. So I think that, being that bound to that OTE to quota ratio is really important very early on in terms of making sure that you've got cost control. As you grow and as you start to understand the opportunity that's out there and you start to break new territory, I think you've really got to start to think of that as a secondary look back to say, okay, overall, as we apply the tops down and then the logical opportunity-based goaling structure, means that we may not stick at 10%, we may not stick at 20 times, but across the board, looking back, we do. And I think if you don't do that quick enough, you lose what I kind of call strategic or more strategic quota deployment, meaning use your quotas to represent what you want to do in that area. You will under quota strategically to drive more excitement and more energy in a particular area that you know is new to you. So, it's all these things. I kind of deviated back to that point just because it's been so relevant to me recently. But yeah, I think overall, when we talk about comp, when they tick that box, think about the ecosystem, think about everything that sits around it and how that's contributed to that comp being right or wrong for that individual, I think is what you've got to do.
How, and I'm just going to drop a note to our audience. If you do have any questions, please also feel free to use the QA section on the right, and we will pick up those Q&As as they come in. I'm curious, Vincent and Siobhan, how have you worked with each other's counterparts in your businesses in the past to make sure that those the incentive plan aligns with the targets and vice versa? Like, what are some tips and tricks you can give, and maybe some learnings?
I'll go first. Differently in different organizations, depending upon their maturity in the way that they think about the incentive piece of sales compensation. In the old days, it was 2 different things. You kind of got brought in, you got told what the strategy was, you got told to go and build sales plans to go execute X, Y, and Z, and make sure it's done for year end in the last month. And if you're asking for money, go in with a helmet on. So, that's an old way of doing it. What I tend to say now is I think that it's an ongoing engagement, right? And it's twofold. It's one, so that I think as a sales comp person in that space, that you are gleaming everything you can, right? It's an ongoing discussion where I need to be able to speak Siobhan's language. I need to understand her concerns. I need to understand what she's trying to achieve. I don't want to do that at the point that I've got 2 months before the end of the year and I'm trying to fight for budget to make some changes. So it's about a really strategic engagement, really understanding. It's not being there every single day, right? But it's about keeping a pace of the planning and the thinking that's going on. If you do that, you start to then, as time comes, be able to make more progressive changes from a sales compensation standpoint. If you don't do that, what you tend to be left with is making sure that you're competitive, making sure that you're doing the right things that the other people in your competitive space are doing. I think if you engage earlier, and that can be like I say, you don't have to talk about rates every time you meet. You don't have to talk about, 50-50, 60-40, but really talk about, what's going on in the business, because that really informs you when you come around and look at that from a sales compensation standpoint and think, actually, does a change in sales compensation add value here to what you're trying to achieve? Or actually, is it a distraction? And can we think about that another time? So engage early, understand their world. And I think the second thing I'd say is, don't be afraid to teach a little, right? Because every sales leader, Siobhan, as well, will be experts in sales compensation design. It just comes with the territory, right? They want to be. So I think, don't be afraid to go very gently and say, let's take you a bit deeper if you want to go, so that when we get to that point of making decisions, you understand what we're talking about. Different leaders will have different levels of understanding. Some will have very little, some will know it inside out. So it's really good very early on to check if there's any sort of gaps you can fill on that side as much as you're receiving information. So early and good. That's what I'd say.
Yeah, picking up on the point about being a strategic partner, I think that's your ideal state. So when you're working through, maybe it's a reorg, your business has evolved and you need to make changes. At what point are you bringing in your comp team to say, this is where we've landed? What is the impact on our reps' compensation now that we've changed, whether it's small, like changes to books of business, or something more fundamental? That part is probably one of the more significant ways that I would have worked with the comp team in the past. You do have some reactive issues, maybe it's we've decided to hire in Berlin and we're losing candidates, or not able to recruit, and the feedback is that we're not meeting the bar. Like, should we review this? And then there's also, which falls maybe somewhere in the middle, and I've certainly been in this before. In fact, probably in every single org I've worked with, we've made mistakes. I think it's really, really hard to get your quota setting and your comp right. And it is a bit of an art and a science. So when you make mistakes, how are you looping in your compensation team to review that? And they come out in different ways. Like maybe it's some kind of, a pulse survey on the organization, or maybe it's something lighter where like you start to immediately recognize that this isn't quite working. So how do you sit down with your compensation team, think through the solution, but also like, what does comms look like on that, and who are your stakeholders for like how you manage that? Because it can be a really, really sensitive topic. So yeah, I think those three elements are probably how I would have worked with them in the past.
We'll talk about business changes in a second, because you've mentioned Vincent. But Siobhan, what are one or two things that you have learned from moments where it didn't work out, where you felt like, oh, I wish I would have known that before. I wish I would have considered that first time around. Yeah.
Okay, let me think. What are some of the... I think a lot of the ones, and this does happen, one of them in particular that I can think of was a result of just the market went a bit bananas. We'd set quotas based on certain expectations for the year, and then unbeknownst to a lot of people, there might be challenges where suddenly it's affecting your churn, your ability to grow. And we've been through, I think a lot of companies have been through this. 2022 was a really tough year for a lot of companies, where you're just not pacing where you expected to be. And that is nobody's fault. Nobody can foresee changes in the market, but you do have to address them. And there's different ways I've seen people resolve that. Like one of the ways I've seen this resolved in the past is just giving a blanket uplift to everybody, where people give like a 20% quota uplift to acknowledge that the market was really hard, and as a result of that we were going to make some changes, and I think that was managed really well, because we were not just saying, well, that wasn't our fault, we couldn't have foreseen market changes, so as you were, we were acknowledging that while it was unforeseen, it's still a problem that we had to deal with. So I think that's one thing that's probably really important, is like, how do you acknowledge when it goes wrong, it's important to do that. And what does that look like? Another example I think I've seen is actually here at Fin. So we're working in this new world of selling an AI product, and we're selling based on the pricing is based on resolution rates, which is really innovative, right? So we're charging 99 cents for per resolution. So when we roll out the agent, the customer agent for any customer that we're selling to, they are using the product to resolve any customer queries that are coming in through the website, and they pay us based on our ability to resolve that issue. But that's a really new world way of pricing. In the past, it would have been a seat model, or maybe there's like kind of a bulk package, and we set quotas based on that. That throws up all sorts of complexities when it comes to, do you give reps bookings quotas? Do you give them billings quotas? And we've had to play around with that a little bit to try and figure out, this is a whole new way of going to market. So I think for us, it was just being very aware that this might be a challenge. We've said it one way, but there's no precedence. So let's see how this goes, and acknowledge if it's working or not working, and course correct quickly.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, AI being the future of almost every business, you really need to understand not only the quota and how to get to there, but also, I guess, the compensation plan as part of that. Mm-hmm. And what we see is, like, very often in those significant business changes, reward becomes sort of an afterthought, and they're kind of looped in when the business strategy has already changed. So you already gave two really good examples of external market factors, or I guess in this case, a token or resolution sort of strategy. Vincent, you've obviously experienced that firsthand from the other side of the spectrum, from the reward side. What are some, I think you've mentioned Cisco was a good example where you changed business model. How did you approach that? What are some things you can share?
I mean, at that scale, there's a lot of people involved. Yeah, I mean, it was a really interesting phase to be in, because depending on what people know, Cisco's model was very much selling boxes and wires and all this sort of stuff. And like many companies, we're actually very quick to move to understand, recurring revenue was the place to go, and subscription-based services. And so that was really interesting. There's probably 50 things that went well, 50 things that didn't go well. What I would say is that I think if I zoom back out from that, I think what did go well was the understanding that the sales compensation piece is the sort of icing on the cake, right? Don't mess with people's money until you understand you can measure it, you can capture it, you can execute. A lot of times when I've seen it done, so in that environment, there was a huge amount of work put into enablement. So really helping the sellers understand that change in sales motion. There was a lot of thought put in terms of, a bit like we talk about AI, what does AI change about the sales plan? Well, it doesn't change anything really. What does it change about the roles? Probably lots, right? So it's kind of like, let's think about what the roles are. The sales plan will write itself. Back when we were looking at a move from sort of TCV to ACV, the same was true. It was about really being thoughtful about what are these roles doing differently today than they did yesterday. And we don't just give them a sales plan to go tell them how to operate. You've got to kind of put enablement, you've got to put training, you've got to have managers really understand how to support those people to understand how they're operating in that model. So I think what worked really well there, that it was thoughtful. And was there enough time? I don't know, but it felt like a reasonable amount of leadway between knowing that's what we're doing, really having a very round discussion, including sales compensation, operations, finance, sales leadership, strategy, looking at the whole thing about how you make this thing successful, and then really sequencing it correctly. I've always said, don't hit people over the sales head to go do something you haven't explained to them how to do it yet, which is, at the worst case scenario, you mentioned, Julia, that sales comp is an afterthought. I think it can be. The other thing I think it can be is used as a sort of marketing tool to kind of go and explain to you why the organization has changed and how it's changed. And I think that's wrong. I think it's the wrong way round. So when things change in an organization, be that breaking new product markets, breaking new geographies, changing your sales motion. The sales compensation plan should make absolute sense to the seller when all these other things have taken place. If you do it the other way around, which is we've worked the strategy out, we know what we're doing, we've got all this stuff, great. Let's put the sales plan in place, because that will tell them now that they don't sell boxes, they sell a relationship, and now they need to care about the renewal piece. That's the wrong way to do it. You know, I always put the kind of, when you finally touch somebody's pay, that needs to make sense to them. They should go, oh, this is backing up what my managers told me. This makes sense now why I attended that training session, why I've heard of this communication. Now my sales compensation plan has changed, and I'm now being paid on recurring revenue. And I understand why part of it's on incremental, because they want me to interact with the front selling sales team. I understand why part of it's on renewal, because that's why we're being told to partner with that team. My point in all of this is that, you know, how does it get done well? I think it's considered. And you don't always have time, but, you know, as best you can, I think really think about the sales compensation plan that really stamps all the other enablement activities you've done as an organization to change the strategy. That should be the piece. Don't ever use it, which I've seen it done many, many, many times, as almost the marketing tool to go instruct a seller now, this is the strategy change and here's your sales plan, go do something different. So yeah, I think really understand the full process. And if you're respectful of that, that's when the changes are most successful that I've seen.
So in this example, you move from box to ARR-based business models and changing compensation. Siobhan, how are you thinking about changing things now, moving into a resolution space? I'm intrigued, and maybe if that's the work in progress, I'd love to hear what you've both seen in the agentic world, in the token world. What are sales compensation structures that make sense in those scenarios?
Yeah, I touched on this briefly, but I think for us, you're trying to make sure that your plan is, one, driving the right behaviors, two, makes sense so the team understand it, and three, that there is consistency across the organization. So when you're sitting as a CFO or a head of sales and you're trying to measure the growth or the revenue growth of the organization, that can become very messy if you're measuring, you know, I don't know, bookings in one area and billings in another area or somewhere else. You have to have some degree of consistency across how you measure what success looks like. And it is difficult to juggle those three, but I kind of start with the principle of one, like I said, having that consistency. So like, what is the number that you're measuring against? Does that make sense to the reps? So, and does it drive the right behaviors? So in terms of making sense and driving the right behaviors, I think they're coupled. So for us, and I know this has been true for other organizations, you're trying to navigate a world where you're looking for them to drive business. Maybe you're looking for them to also land new logos, so you don't get too focused on expansion. You're looking for your reps to maybe land multiple products. So maybe you're starting to bring other products into the market, and all of a sudden there's different jobs to be done across the team, and there is a temptation to bake all of that into the sales compensation plan. So you're maybe setting a plan against, okay, you have a number that's made up of 70% ARR, and there's 20% for like landing new logos, and there's another 10% for, I don't know, selling some other feature function. That's too messy, and it becomes messy really quickly. To me, you maybe have two variables. In an ideal world, you have one number that you look to achieve against. There are scenarios where I've seen companies also give a percentage of compensation towards landing new business logos when there's a bit of crossover between teams managing existing and new business accounts. But anything more than that, it becomes just too complicated, and it's not driving specific incentives, it's just driving frustration. If there is a world where what you're trying to drive, and a lot of companies find themselves, especially when selling AI products, in this space of you're moving really, really fast and it's highly competitive and you're trying to win. And so you do have an environment where you're expanding, you're adding new logos, you're trying to get reps to focus on new products and features. to me, that's more of and new markets, maybe that's an org design issue. So you've got to think about how you use your people in your organization to solve each of those pieces that you're trying to drive into the market. It's not a compensation. It's not a thing that your compensation plan would solve for.
Yeah, you kind of half answered a question from the chat. Nicole asks, is how can a business set effective, fair quotas that drive the right behaviors across teams, across different teams? And sounds to me that you say make it simpler so people can actually understand what behavior they're driving rather than trying to layer in 5, 6, 7 different metrics. Is that fair?
Yeah, don't try and drive every business decision or behavior through a quota plan. That's one way to drive behavior. You drive the most important behaviors through that plan. But like I said, anything else, you think about your org design and what jobs you're giving people to do and all of your supporting functions. And that comes down to setting strategy and vision and how you drive communication. That's another job to be done in the org.
Vincent, I see you nodding.
Yeah, no, I am. I suppose I'm, and looking at two things. I think you're absolutely right. I think as you evolve, you've got to say, and it goes right full circle to what we said right at the top, which is, what is a sales plan that's got schizophrenia look? Make them feel like it makes you feel like you don't understand how you compartmentalize the exercise and tell people to go do what they do. So you've lost focus. I think one of the things I'd add addition, and this is what I've seen more, and I think it is the realities of a smaller company, in that we've just said, let's recognize the different roles that exist today so that we can compensate them correctly from a sales compensation standpoint. So we stop giving everybody 5 measures and we give 5 people 1 each, right, in a very simple way. The other thing I've seen, which is much tougher to address, is it the same people that you need for these new models? One of the things I think slows down progress when you're really trying to evolve quickly to your sales motion and your strategy is this, and it's a European thing, maybe more than I've seen outside of Europe, which is I've got to do this new thing with the same number of counters on my table, and those counters must be the same. I don't know if I'm explaining myself very well, and I don't want to sound hard. I'm just saying it's what can slow it down is you're trying to move to a new model. You understand the roles you need. You understand how to compensate them. It would have to be quite a high degree of luck to have 100% of the people you've got in the old model suitable to fit the new one. And I think that's a piece that maybe smaller companies are a tiny bit scared to face head on. And it can slow the progress down, because then what you get is this sort of slow mix of what you did do. So what you're designing for is sort of based upon your current sort of head count and the way they're compensated. So it can make you move slower. So I would say, out of everything you just talked about, I think, yes, you're looking at the role. You need to look at the role. You need to look at, how you're trying to attack the sales cycle. What does that mean? What does that change from a sales compensation standpoint? And then I just add that last point, which is it tells you you're prime to review skill assessment to make sure that who was an AM yesterday is now an AI adoption specialist. Do you know what I mean? They might, it's that kind of like, well, that feels like let's put it in that role. But I do think there's a real headcount assessment and some brave moves that need to take place when you're evolving your model.
Yeah. Okay. I see there's a few more questions in the chat, so let's focus time on this. There was one question from Joe that I think goes in a similar direction. So he was mentioning going through acquisitions and trying to harmonize different comp structures. And in this case, specifically, moving a team to a potentially less generous compensation plan from what they were before. Although their base seems to still remain at market. So how would you approach that? Maybe you've had that in the past, Vincent.
One of, like I say, my longest period was at Cisco. One of its growth strategies was acquisition. I think at the point I was there, it was like 150, 160. It's probably hundreds and hundreds now. Tough one. I think you've got to believe in what you're doing. I think with everything you do, if they're doing something different, fine. I think you can assess. There's always value to be had from looking at different compensation models. I think you've got to be really clear on what you're doing. Is what you're doing fit for purpose? If that's the case, then you're not talking about sales compensation plans anymore. You're talking about an employee transition strategy. So a bit to my kind of point earlier, let's not try and drag two things together and make half of nothing decent. Get really clear on what you're doing. I believe in this. We've got the right structure. We've matched to the market. It's sustainable. It's doing what we need to do. We've just acquired a new business. The model is not exactly the same. Do we create some hybrid plan? No, because that's the middle of nowhere and does the middle of nothing. What you really do is shift to say, okay, we're not talking about designing sales compensation plans. We're talking about employee transition. So you really think about ways in which you can transition people to that. Not everybody will survive that journey. That's another reality of acquisition integration. Not everybody wants to come to that place. Not everybody wants to take that step. So you're focusing on your very key players. You're making sure that transition is successful. Even then, if they don't fit your model, it doesn't fit your model. It's your model. Okay, so there's questions raised. So my shorter answer is you don't make a mashup of the two. That's what you don't do from a sales plan. You leave them aside. Revisit what you're doing if necessary. Shift over to an employee transition strategy. You need your HR team, you need your comp team, you need your full team with you at that point. It's less about the sales at that point.
Interesting, yeah. Another challenge, which I think is one for you, Siobhan, to answer, is someone in chat, Sophie, mentioned that the combined targets for the AEs are 80% below the overall sales target. I'm considering hiring another AE, but that might make the rest of the team unhappy because they might think they're getting even less leads. How should I handle that? So I have a few thoughts on this myself, but I'm curious how you've handled this in the past.
Yeah, I can start, Julia, but yeah, I'd be curious to hear from the sales leader as well on this. I think if I can be candid, that just comes down to the sales plan hasn't probably been accurately set. I think usually how I would have operated is that you would have your sales quota, you bake in a percentage of over-assign. So your number maybe is, I don't know, for argument's sake, $1 million, and your bottoms up roll up from your team, if everyone was to hit quota, is 100 or 1.1 million. So you should be over, not necessarily under, is usually how we would kind of manage for that. The reason is, generally speaking, a principle that I've seen used, and again, curious on your experiences here, is that good quota setting typically looks like somewhere between 60 and 80%, everyone has a different view on this, of your reps attaining quota. So if you're operating on that principle, then that's where the over-assign comes in. If you're assuming otherwise, and maybe that's the case in this instance where you expect everyone to hit 120%, then that's kind of slightly different. But yeah, in terms of how to make that up, it's kind of hard to answer, because if you're going to hire another AE, you have to make sure that the TAM is there to support it and the book of business is there to support that. So I would say absolutely, if you feel like you're not at kind of like stretch in that space, and you have a whole other book of business that another AE could go after, and you have the remit to do that, then yes, that is probably the most logical way of course correcting.
I would second that. I think the main question that I would ask myself is, why are you looking to hire another AE, right? There could be a variety of reasons. The ones that Siobhan just mentioned, quite straightforward, right? You're trying to grow the business, and there is enough TAM and there is enough leads to justify that hire. I would say that needs to be a given. There might be other reasons. Maybe certain people are not the right talent that you need moving forward, so you're being more proactive, or you are planning for a bigger change in a team. Maybe someone's transitioning out, promoted, whatever it may be. So again, you're being proactive. I would survey first, or I would question first why you're looking to hire. Or is it your boss saying, oh, more AEs equals more money? A very common startup misconception. Everything, I'd second that Siobhan said. And then separately, I would, if you say there is enough TAM and there is actually enough opportunity, and you're worried about how this will land with the other reps, going back to what Vincent said earlier, communication and enablement sounds to me like the direction you might want to travel. Does your team actually understand how lead distribution works, how they're getting to target, what levers they can pull, and that an additional person in the team will not take away but actually add value to them? Or do they not understand that, and they just simply go on the back of, well, my territory is going to split in half. So I think by educating your decision-making process, why you're doing things, the reason you're doing them, and giving them a plan of how they're still going to hit quota is probably the way, my suggestion in this scenario.
Yeah, makes sense.
I do have another interesting question in here, and it is similar to what we've talked about last time, Vincent and Siobhan, is sort of, bigger companies obviously eventually have a reward team, but also the bigger the company, finance also comes into the mix. So in a smaller org, what does the relationship with finance look like out of your experience? Where do roles and decision-making accountability begin and end? So what role does finance play in the decision-making? Maybe reward or the people team, and I guess sales as well. Vincent, what's your experience here?
In the best scenarios, they've been actively engaged. In scenarios that I don't think are successful, they've been quite distant. It depends on how the finance organization is structured. You should be fiscally responsible in what you're doing, particularly in a small company, right? You need to have sustainable growth. Growth on its own is great, and that will keep you going for so long, and then you'll hit your 2-4 years or whatever, or you'll hit the end of the pandemic, or you hit something that suddenly tells you that, hold on a minute, I know we're growing, but we're just paying everybody lots. Can we think about paying the right people lots, and maybe stop paying people that aren't doing what we want them not so much? And what does that come at as a bill? Because now it's come into focus what your commission spend is becoming. So you can inflate your commission spend very quickly. So I would say, I think finance has a huge role to play. Two ends of the spectrum, both in terms of from a quota, opportunity perspective, finance are in that space, and then really from a cost perspective, I think finance are in there. You don't want an engagement model that has finance locked in a dark room, and then me, the sales leader, and somebody else turning up and asking for $2 million. Do you know what I mean? It's not the right way it works. So I think there's an obligation for the CFA, for part of that finance team, to be engaged in what's attributing to that compensation and incentive spend, not to sort of think about it once a year, straight their chin, have an opinion, and say no. Do you know what I mean? I think they've got to be engaged. When they're not so successful, when they are, you can really start to make things move. Would be my opinion on that. So
involve them as early as you can.
Yeah. You want to be interested, make them interested. That's what you gotta do.
Cool. And then we're looking at it at the end of time, but there was one more question I didn't want to skip, one for you, Siobhan. How do you design your AE's ramping strategy? So how are you thinking about ramping quotas or ramping, I would say, maybe payouts even? Mm-hmm. What are some considerations, and how have you thought in the past about accelerating AE ramp up?
Yeah, sure. This is always, I feel like, a contentious point in every organization. And it's a really hard one to get right, because maybe to the previous point, you are juggling with expectations of your finance team, and you're looking to get this person up and running as quickly as possible. But yeah, a few principles, I think. One is that you're probably starting with your sales cycle. So you've got to anchor there, like, what is the length of your sales cycle? That could be different per company, or maybe within a company it's different depending on SMB versus enterprise. So maybe it's a 30-day sales cycle, in which case your ramp is like 1 to 2 months. Maybe it's closer to 6 to 9 month enterprise cycle, in which case your ramp is closer to 9 to 12 months. So I think that's the first anchor. The second is, this is ever evolving. So you should always be pulling historical data on your ramping cohorts to make sure that you are arriving at a realistic number. It is hard to get right, but it's really important to get right. You can lose some really good people, or even honestly get rid of some really good people who just needed more structure or just a longer ramp period than what you had anticipated. Hence why historical data is really important to build over time. So do keep like a record of that. I think the other thing is bearing in mind 2 other factors, like, is there any kind of commission guarantees that you're giving up front? That varies again dependent on the deal cycle. So, are you guaranteeing them a certain percentage or even 100% of their compensation during their first month or two of ramp cycle? Or are you just giving them a actual just reduced ARR number, and when they hit that 100% ARR, they achieve their OTE? What else? What other variables are there? There's something else in my mind. No, I think they're probably like maybe the main components. Vincent, I don't know if I'm missing anything there. I'm trying to think if there's anything else.
No, I think you got the main point right at the beginning, which is ramping is really hard to get right. But I would say I think the really crucial point there is keep reviewing the data. It changes every half year, definitely every year, and you want to put some skin in the game. But put that skin in the game with some protection stuff around it, okay? Because the worst case scenario is you have a few people join the company, earn more than they will ever earn for the next 2 years, at that sort of rate. So you've got to try and avoid that. So I'm not a big fan of ramping, but it's really hard to get right. But yeah, you make numbers your friend in that environment. Yeah.
Great. All right. We've come to an end. And before we do, one final question. If someone hasn't reviewed their sales comp plan in a year, but now are looking at it, what's the one thing you think they should look at, or the one question they might need to ask when they look at it?
Yeah, I can start. I think just bring it back to first principles. Like, why did you set the comp plan in place? What behaviors are you trying to drive? And is it achieving those behaviors? It sounds basic, but that's what it comes down to.
If my coach is going, I would agree. Can I understand it? Can I explain it to my grandma? Can I to she? And could I execute this with twice the amount of salespeople? Maybe those couple of things, just to give you a sense of gone too far down the rat hole. You know what I mean?
Back to basics and the grandma question. I like it. Thank you so much, Siobhan and Vincent. I hope you have a lovely rest of the week, and thanks everyone for listening in. And I hope until another time.
Thank you so much, Julia.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.